Live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to be here tonight. Of course, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And tonight's going to be a very special episode. We're in episode X66, and X66 is going to bring us to Helena Blavatsky, deep in the Hotzone. Now, Blavatsky, of course, is the founding member of the Theosophical Society in America. Interesting little point about tonight, as we're looking out at everyone joining the show, and it's a great crowd tonight, is that this is in fact the 144th anniversary of the founding of the Theosophical Society in New York by Henry Olcott, Helena Blavatsky, and Emma Hardinge Britton, and William Q. Judge. Of course, we've covered our friends Emma Britton before on the show, but wow, this is a little bit amazing.
And this was just an accident. You hadn't intended on
It's
doing
true.
Blavatsky.
I mean, here we are. Well, we're at Friday the 13th. And also, well, it's a full moon out there.
That's true. But what I'm saying is that Blavatsky came up accidentally, and
It
all
is.
of this is just incredibly
It's that kind of
coincidental.
incredible kismet that goes on so much with the X series. But tonight's show is the actual founding anniversary, 144, of the Theosophical Society. There's something else you wanted to tell me about that moon, though. It is...
Well, it's the harvest moon.
Aha.
So, and what I found out from Twitter is that why it's called the harvest moon is that the peasants, the farmers, used to go out under the full moon this time of year to harvest their crops. So it was kind of all hands on deck, pulling up the turnips and whatnot at night. You know, you wouldn't think that. You'd think that they would only harvest during the day, but it's actually cooler at night, and they'd have everybody doing it as quickly as possible.
Yes. I was just thinking you did a little bit of peasant fashion chic yourself tonight.
I'm wearing overalls today. The farmer look.
That is really interesting. Well, the other thing about this moon is it's a micro moon, which means it's the moon, even though it's full, is the furthest away from the Earth for a full moon. So it's one of those you can now you see it, now you don't kind of moons. But all very interesting. Friday the 13th and the anniversary, somehow it just feels just right to look at a figure like Helena Blavatsky, who really is often, you know, her impact is not always understood, but really from yoga to meditation to all sorts of things that we see now widespread in Western culture, it is largely Helena Blavatsky that brought that to the center and to the fore and allowed other incredible figures like Yogananda from the East to really have some understanding and to really pave the ground for them in advance so that we would start to get on with this. Oh, you know, there's a third eye, there's a higher consciousness. But the Theosophical Society was a lot more than just an Eastern meditation society, which in 1875 would have been radical enough. And Blavatsky is a very interesting, sometimes controversial character as the leader of the Theosophical Society. She's widely understood by mystery school adepts like Rudolf Steiner to have been one of the most consequential personalities from the mystery schools to come out to the public. And we'll see tonight that she influenced the entire wave of anthroposophy and a lot of very unusual things in relation to Blavatsky's mission to bring these things to the fore, but beyond that also to bring us into this subject of Atlantis and the major agenda that the mystery schools had with having us understand in that period there was advanced technology, so that by the time we got to it in the 21st century, we'd be ready because humanity had gone through something similar before, but much more powerful in the sense that it had brought on incredible destruction. So this is going to be a very special episode when we consider her background and career, but how it lines up with her in the Hotzone is also quite fascinating. Just to catch everyone up, we last week revealed that Tom Garden was in fact Ted Morgan, who is Sange de Gramont, who really was this French noble who came over here and stripped all of his titles off to become a journalist and was a deep intelligence operator. Quite a remarkable figure, and this research on Tom Garden, which is this kind of esoteric pseudonym that's passed around in these circles, and which is an anagram of both Ted Morgan, who's the writer, and who Sanche de Gramont became, as we explained last week. And I highly recommend watching that episode in conjunction with this one. But one of the most fascinating aspects, I think, when we look at Gramont is that he represents the European arm, the European French nobility, and its involvement with this advanced technology left over in the Hotzone, which is now the subject of so much geopolitical action right there off 90 miles off the shores of the United States. Now, the Hotzone, I like to show the map right at the beginning so we all know what we're discussing. And basically, it's this area here, over by the Straits of Florida. There's Bimini. That's the Bimini Road ruins up there. And over here we have the western tip of Cuba, right where San Antonio, Cuba is here. And that is where Polina Zalitsky, the remarkable oceanographer, found an underwater city, a complete metropolitan city, which we've shown in this program before, and was largely shut down, and we need to bring her findings back to light. And over here, the Yucatan Peninsula, and this, in general, constitutes the Hotzone, and we also get into a little bit further down, Belize and so on. And some of the Caribbean reaches into that. Tonight, all of these areas are going to play strongly into Helena Blavatsky's influence and her own activities in the Hotzone, including the fact that the Theosophical Society had over 300 branches there in the Hotzone in Cuba, and that Henry Olcott, as a founding member of Theosophy, visited Cuba in 1908, checking in on the many lodges that they had there. And they did something interesting with the lodges, is they'd use the individual names. So they would say, this is the Blavatsky Lodge, that's the Olcott Lodge, this is the Annie Besant Lodge. So it's a slightly different setup in general. Now, another interesting thing about Cuba is that we were allowed, as Masons, when we look at these groups, the Masons were allowed to proliferate, which if you get into the Cuban Revolution, like any communist revolution, once it went in that direction, they always throw the Masons out. So it's very, very strange that both Masons and Theosophists were allowed to stay in Cuba. Obviously, their secrets and what they were doing was very, very important indeed, and the authorities there understood that. One of the things I also want to point out before we get into deep here is tonight we're going to be taking questions in the second half of the program with Olivia fielding those and putting together this incredible tapestry of ideas in the ideas room. And we'll be taking the questions in the second half of the program, so ask them all in caps and make sure it relates to the Hotzone and the Theosophical Society. It's interesting for us to look back over 144 years of the Theosophical Society, because I think what we find, very interestingly, is the immense impact that they had, and spawning other movements like anthroposophy, which created things like biodynamic farming and eurythmy and so on, and the incredible impact that they would have on other movements like Golden Dawn and some of the later things that happened, and some really powerful figures that came out of the movement, like Blavatsky, like Olcott, like Krishnamurti. So what we're looking at with the Theosophical Society is the mystery schools moving public, as they had to do in this period, founding now September 13th, 1875, in New York City. And what was happening, if we get really a snapshot there, is there had been about 30 years of struggle between the mystery schools about how to handle this incredible scientific materialism that was being dumped wholesale on the public. And as we're seeing the fruits of that now with all the transhumanism and what the Steiner people call harmonic activity, then we're looking really at I would say they were giving us tools, almost things where humanity could defend itself against this onslaught. But the mystery schools were not a unity, and this is important to understand. They were many different mystery schools, and they understood many of the same tenets, but they were set up in different structures. One of the things that we need to be clear about when we look at the mystery schools is that a lot of them didn't want to give up any of the secrecy, even though they saw this onslaught. But there was a group inside the mystery schools that saw this incredible kind of sort of Damocles hanging over humanity and said, we have to do something. And so they let out things like life after death. They let out secrets like reincarnation. They let things out into the Western mind that just really weren't there. And as we're studying and looking at the incredible things that Blavatsky did, we have to understand this. It's one thing for someone to come out now as a woman, as a foreigner, with an incredibly new revelation around different spiritual things. But back then, the idea of a foreign woman coming into a different country and giving them basically a new view on religion and esoteric studies, you can imagine the kind of pressure that she was under. If you go back just 200 years from her time, you have the witch burnings in Salem. So, you know, we have to understand the kind of bravery that was involved. And I think bravery is a real hallmark of the things that Blavatsky did. And we're also going to see that there were groups in the future, anything from New Age groups to Nazi groups, which would appropriate her ideas and misuse them. And then later it would be used as a way to try to discredit Blavatsky. But in fact, her ideas have stood the test of time, and we'll see that so much of what she put forward was so advanced for this period, and that this move of the mystery schools going public was crucial. And without it, we'd be really many steps behind, and we wouldn't have these incredible tools that we do now. Yes, Mrs.
Scarlet Fire wanted to say, no burnings in Salem, but hangings were there, as were crushings.
Oh, that's true. Well,
that's
yes,
true.
but they're known as the
But-
Salem witch trials
yeah.
because that's the area there. But we know
But
it
we
was
had plenty
Dover.
of witch burnings in Europe. So.
Yes, yes, good point. I do think there's also something quite fascinating that we are going to get into tonight, which is there is something related to pirates that has a great role in the Theosophical Society story and Blavatsky's story. And in fact, we're going to find that one of the most influential pirates, or most famous in history, played a great role in Theosophy, oddly enough.
Can you believe it?
So we are, you know, you're going to have to get your pirate on for this one. And it is quite remarkable. I mean, as you know, I like to start with the TKO, and I'm I'm not going to wait long for it. But let's give a little more on Blavatsky first, because I think that we need to. I have noticed in a number of different settings that Blavatsky's name is misused, and it is her ideas are mischaracterized. She. You know, recently I saw a program where they were like, and that's when Crowley and Blavatsky started the mystery schools or something. I mean, Crowley picked up on these ideas, you know, more around 1900, and then that way after Blavatsky. And he was going in a totally black occult way, whereas she was working with the Mahatmas, who are ascended masters, who are holy men trying to raise the consciousness of Earth, you know, so we have to get that straight. There's a little bit of, and this happens a lot in hardcore Bible-thumping Christian circles, of just anything that's in the mystery or the esoteric is all lumped together as one big occult trip, but it's not. There's a very huge difference, and we need to get to that difference. And I think that people who look at things through a narrow religious window make a big mistake, because that's not what the religion is there to teach them, is to teach them a broader stroke and to understand the incredible spiritual force behind these religions. And I don't think that means giving up, you know, your tenets by any stretch of the imagination. It just means making room for other ideas. But I have seen this lumping in of Crowley and some of that OTO stuff with Theosophy, and you know, there's no coordination between these groups. Theosophy is so different from the OTO, and it's so different from Crowley. And you know, their motto in Theosophy is, there is no religion higher than truth. You know, and the motto of the Crowley stuff is, do what you will be the whole of the law. It's very different. So we have to, whenever we get into this esoteric occult line, we need to separate, just like we do on Dark Journalist with conspiracy ideas, which are usually counter to the official story, versus junk conspiracy. Conspiracy idea, 9/11 was an inside job, for example. We just had that anniversary here. And junk conspiracy, flat Earth, it's a junk conspiracy. There's no evidence to support it. So we have to be able to separate these things, separate the wheat from the chaff to get to the good stuff. And it's very important with Blavatsky that we do that. Now, that being said, she was born, if we go back, she actually had some kind of remarkable upbringing in so many ways. She was born now in July of 1831, and she was born into kind of a well-to-do, well-regarded family, and it was her grandfather had this incredible library, and he was associated with a number of different groups that would kind of be like Masonic groups here, but they were fraternities, and so he had a great grasp of different knowledge systems, and I think she learned a lot just being in that environment. But her actual name was Helena Petrovna, but somewhere along the line, a general from Russia, where she was part of Russia at the time, the Ukraine, but there was a general named Blavatsky who was very smitten with her, and somehow the family arranged it that she would marry him. And as soon as they were married, she disappeared. And she did not consummate the marriage. She left with just the name, but kept it the rest of her life. And she had a remarkable upbringing in the sense that she, all the time, according to her sister, had these sort of imaginary playmates. She could predict things. She had a kind of almost poltergeist activity around her. So her psychic abilities were very obvious early on. One of the interesting comments that Rudolf Steiner makes in relation to Blavatsky is that the mystery schools, by the very astrology of her birth, knew there was this very important personality to mystery school work coming in. So they had been kind of on the lookout for this amazing woman. And her life early on led her into very, very unusual circles. One of the circles that she was led into was searching for higher esoteric knowledge and going to places as far-flung as Tibet to find it, and going to the Himalayas. And these are very dangerous travels for a woman in that period. But she was also an incredible concert pianist, and so she would tour around, places like Cairo, doing this incredible routine of concert piano with an opera singer. So it's a very interesting and adventurous life that she had. And another fascinating thing to think about is that when we look at Blavatsky, we can say that she wrote over 60,000 words between 1874 and her death in 1891. But before 1874, she had not written anything publicly. Absolutely nothing. So we can see that she was prepared for this long period, and then boom, right into it she went from about 40 onwards. So I think that this is very significant when we look at her lives, and there's many missing chapters when we went back there. Oddly enough, it was Annie Besant who was going through a number of her things in London after she passed away, who found out that there were travel companions that she had in the 1850s to give us details of some of these trips, but that Blavatsky had kept a very good record of a number of these trips. And a lot of those trips took her directly into the Bahamas, into Cuba, into the Hotzone. It also took her to America far before she landed there in New York. She had been in New Mexico, the Pueblo Indians she had visited. She'd been in Peru, and she had studied and looked for signs of Viracocha and this incredible religion that the Incas had. But she had spent a lot of time in Cuba, and Cuba becomes a major theosophical beachhead by the time we get to the turn of the century. Yes, Miss Olivia?
Well, I had this question,
Uh-huh.
and Esoteric 369 Wall had the same question, which
Ah.
is what actual date in July? What?
Oh, for her birthday?
Yes.
Well, it's
Was
very
she a
interesting.
Cancer?
There's two that are listed. One of them is July 31st,
Mm-hmm.
and the other is August 3rd. I don't know why
It
there's
makes
two dates.
more sense, I think, that she's a Leo than a
Yes,
Cancer. I don't
no
think she,
question.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Now, I do think it's quite fascinating because very often people like Gurdjieff or like Blavatsky, you will notice, and they will show up with two different dates for their birth. And Gurdjieff had it 1877 and 1872, so it was actually years different. Hers is just 4 days different, which might have just been a record-keeping issue. But you do find very often with these esoteric masters that there's a little bit of confusion about exactly when their date of birth is, and that might be to thwart anyone who's trying to analyze them astrologically. Yes.
Since you just mentioned Gurdjieff, 48 Tom W. said, Gurdjieff said that Theosophy was one of many imitation esoteric systems. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, he's talking about Theosophy there to Ouspensky somewhere around 1915. And I think it can be widely agreed that by 1915, a lot of what made Theosophy great had been broken down. Now, there have been efforts to rebuild it, and there have been people after the fact, like Alice Bailey, who went her own direction with it. But from where it started, with this incredible woman coming on the scene, giving us information about Atlantis, giving us that esoteric background, telling us about the Ascended Masters, and giving away what Rudolf Steiner said were some of the biggest mystery school secrets in order to really open this process up. But believe it or not, we have to go even further back to get the right picture. So what we're going to do is going to kind of move into this period just before Blavatsky shows up. And I want to remind everyone that you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're deep already into episode 66, and it is all about the mystery school adept Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. And this episode is going to show in detail how her work is related to some of the things we've been following in the Hotzone, and how this whole idea of Atlantis, and how this whole idea of Atlantis rising and land rising off the East Coast is very pivotal to her ideas of root races and the next root race that we're moving into, which I've said before that in Theosophy, they kind of see it very positively. You know, we're moving into the next root race, and that next root race is naturally psychic. It's naturally more peaceful. It's generally in line with spiritual intentions. And what needs to happen is this land rises off the East Coast, and that land becomes their inspiration. It becomes their hunting ground. It's like the new America, as we've seen New Atlantis, America was originally. So we have this in the mystery schools, and then Casey came along and started to tell us exactly where and when this was going to happen, and how Poseidia, which is a stretch off Bimini in the Hotzone, where a series of temples were going to rise, and this is what caused so much of the interesting kind of geopolitical and intelligence moves to try to be there when that happened, and also to find those ruins, because there are a lot of archaeological wars involved. And if it relates to ancient technology, you can see very much how it relates to our modern technology and where we are now. So this whole kind of picture starts to form of the mystery schools, giving us this information. And then when we've brought in figures like Hemingway being in Bimini and being in Cuba and the unusual activities there, and Howard Hughes being there in the Tom Garden saga that we recounted last week, we're starting to get an idea and a picture that there's a large-scale game going on there about these ruins and about this land rising. And we have to get some knowledge about who the players are in that game, what it's all about, and why the mystery schools emphasize it to such a degree. So when we say Atlantis Mystery School in the title of this episode, there's a good reason for it, because the mystery schools made Atlantis dead center for everything that they were putting forth. Something about us understanding where we came from was absolutely crucial. So there's a couple of quotes now that we have about basically the theosophical idea of Atlantis from Blavatsky that I think is crucial. And I think there's something that's going to come up in relation to this tonight, which is, you know, when we think about theosophy, we have to think about it as a spiritual education movement on one hand, and also on the other hand as a political force, because as we know, Annie Besant went on to sponsor people like Gandhi, and he gave him the name Mahatma, and India Home Rule, and sponsored things like Ireland Home Rule, and a lot of these movements came directly out of the Theosophical Society. Some of the more high-profile members over the years, people like Thomas Edison, they understood that there was something very powerful going on here, and I think that we need to get ourselves on that level as well, because when we think of some of the kind of more adventurous technology that has been talked about in the late 19th century, early 20th century, this is the period. And it is theosophy that has that role in sort of shepherding that technology and hiding it from the wrong sources. So this comes into the picture as we talk about it. But let's get into a couple of interesting quotes. What I'm going to do, actually, is I'm going to jump to how Steiner, Rudolf Steiner, who was the head of spiritual science for anthroposophy, he's an Austrian philosopher, and his period now is very interesting because it was right around the end of Blavatsky's life, and then it is her protege, Annie Besant, who brings him into the theosophical fold, and he gets a great deal of knowledge and inspiration from working with Besant, but he's starting to see that the old theosophy is falling apart, and that's how he breaks off, but he's with them for more than a decade. So some of his observations about Blavatsky really give us that insight about who she was and her position with the mystery schools, which I think is crucial. So I'm going to read a little bit about that. And Miss Olivia, before I hop into this, how are you doing out there?
I'm doing great. Do you want just a little twist on this evening?
Of course.
Okay, so Esoteric 369 Wall said, tonight at Coral Castle in Florida,
yes,
they are having an all-night ghost watching gathering.
Isn't that interesting?
Great?
Wow.
Man, I wish I was there.
There's some
it's
incredible...
very nice to be here, but that would be fun.
There's some really wild kismet tonight because, of course, Florida comes up tonight in our episode as well.
Yes, it does.
All right, let's try this. Steiner is outlining why the mystery schools chose Blavatsky to deliver this incredible message, and how there had been a battle inside the mystery schools about how this would come out. And they had tried a number of other people to do this. For example, there's a very interesting book out now called Talking to the Dead about Kate and Maggie Fox. And the Fox sisters in 1848 were doing these incredible seances, and they had these incredible psychic abilities. And there's a wonderful recounting by Emma Britton of seeing them, when they're first starting out in New York there, just giving people these readings in New York and literally being like sidewalk psychics. But they started a trend that became a craze in America, and this was the mystery school's attempt to break through this scientific materialism into a spiritualism where we would understand the spiritual side of things, and we could kind of have some of that knowledge so we wouldn't get swallowed whole by the rise of industry. But this became a very, a real battleground between the mystery schools. But they went into this direction of using women as mediums, and Steiner explains this a little bit before we get to Blavatsky, and here we go. This is directly from a lecture that Steiner gave called Occult Schools in the 19th Century. Quote, "Now the female organism is adapted by nature to preserve atavistic clairvoyance longer, whereas male mediums were becoming almost unknown in this period. Female mediums were still to be found and used while the compromise still held between the mystery schools. But now there came into the occultist field of observation someone who possessed mediumistic faculties in the very highest degree. This was Madame Blavatsky. A person adapted through certain subconscious parts of her organism to draw a great deal, a very great deal, from the spiritual world. Now think of what possibilities this opened up for the world. One of the most individuals developed in occultism, a personality appeared who, through the peculiar nature of her organism, many, many things from the spiritual world could be revealed by means of her subconscious faculties. Blavatsky had abilities which hadn't been seen in hundreds of years. And we used to have these, say in Greek times with the Greek mysteries, we had these incredible mediums walking around. But her ability to go consciously into the spirit world, stay conscious and retain the information and come back with it was highly unusual. According to Steiner, she was, such an unusual personality that she was going to change the world. He says further, an occultist who at that time was alert to the sign of the times, there in the 1860s, could say to himself, now a personality has appeared who through her peculiar organic constitution can produce the very ancient traditional teaching existing among us in the form of symbols only. It was emphatically this personality who, simply because of her organic makeup, afforded the possibility of again demonstrating what had for a long time been known only through tradition. She could bring it back. She could manifest things through unusual abilities. So her abilities were going to be completely off the charts. Let us be quite clear and to the point. Blavatsky was regarded as someone through whom, as out of an electrically charged Leyden jar, electric sparks of occult truths could be produced. Now, I'll tell you something about Rudolf Steiner, which is he doesn't give compliments so easily. So it's quite remarkable that he's saying this, and it shows the kind of reverence that he had for her abilities. Now let's go a little bit further. He talks a little bit about how she came to be aware that she was this compromised figure for the mystery schools, and this is interesting. So it was not long before Blavatsky was having to face a decision. A hint came to her from the side of the left-hand schools that she was a personality of key importance. In the anthroposophical view of the mystery schools, there are varying sides. There's the right-hand path, which is those looking to move humanity forward. There's the left-hand path, which are more selfish. And then there's the extreme left-hand path, that's totally like black magic. And on the light side, it's just, the mystery schools of which we're talking about, Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Rosicrucians. These are right-hand schools. They are schools that are there to move the culture forward. And a lot of the secret society activity that we see, it might be updated in things like Bohemian Grove and all that now, that's all left-hand side. So when he says that someone in the left-hand schools told her this, that she was a personality of key importance, this is interesting because that had to be revealed to her. It was going to be revealed to her, but she got it a little bit early. And a lot of people from those schools wanted to manipulate her because she had these incredible abilities. She knew very well, but was not aware of how significant she was as a personality. She knew very well that her abilities were off the charts. This was first disclosed to her by the left. Now, Blavatsky was fundamentally honest by nature, and after this hint had been given her from a quarter which she would have hardly approved because of her fundamental honesty, she tried on her side to reach a kind of occult brotherhood in Europe. Something very fine might have resulted from this, because through mediumship, she could have been able to furnish confirmations of really phenomenal importance in what was known to the initiates from theories and symbolism. So she was going to be she was going to bring back the living tradition of the esoteric information, and not just a tradition of like, we used to be able to do these things, and this is the history that, the Egyptians had great mystery magic. She was going to actually be able to reanimate this entire process. Now, he says, she wasn't only thoroughly honest, however, she's also what we call in German Frechtag, And a frekdok means someone who doesn't take orders easily. She had in her personality that particularly is common in those inclined to mediumship, namely a lack of consistency in external actions. There were moments when she would be very audacious, and in one of these fits of audacity, she told the Brotherhood, I want you to let me join, and here is how it's going to be because I've learned so much from you guys. And she started to demand terms from them. And so they started to see her as a problem, actually. And this is where, right around the period of the founding of Theosophy. So what happened was she approached the American Brotherhood. This American Brotherhood was one that wavered between the right and the left. And this is interesting, that there were schools who fundamentally were about moving things forward, but had been infiltrated by secret societies who were trying to use some of the mystery school information for bad purposes. So since they were between the two, she had approached them and at all events had the prospect of discovering things of tremendous value concerning the spiritual world. Now, other brotherhoods start to take interest in her, and basically it becomes a phenomenal round robin where all these groups are trying to just get their hands on her, and she is looking around at all these options and also people trying to manipulate her, and she's getting overwhelmed. So what happens in the middle of this is she produces the book Isis Unveiled in 1877, after the founding of the Theosophical Society. And Isis Unveiled brings forward all of these truths pertaining to the esoteric world. It talks about root races, it talks about things that had just never been admitted in public, and the mystery schools are aghast at how many things that she's letting out. Because remember, with the mystery schools, so much of their program is to keep things secret and to let it out to the public in small doses and experiment with it to help move the culture along. And they're really worried that she, because of her abilities, has this kind of stronghold, this ability to move in there. And while all this is happening, something very peculiar takes place, which is one of her guides is revealed through her conversations with Henry Olcott. I just want to mention about Olcott is that he became her partner in Theosophy. And Henry Olcott was a military man, he was a general, and he was someone who was on what was the kind of Warren Commission of its day for the Lincoln assassination, because there were so many unusual factors that had not been answered there. And he had retired from being a colonel, and he was doing now these articles in a big New York newspaper on spiritualism. And it lands him in a place called the Eddy Farm. Now, I just want to spend a moment on this because I think it's worth noting. The Eddy Farm is a place where, in the middle of Vermont, in the middle of farm country, we see this incredible spiritualism taking place where people are having these seances, they are seeing apparitions, and it is literally like, the Salem witch trials on overdrive, where, just as those they called witches were getting these incredible visions and things, they are having a real renaissance of these abilities. So something is happening and people are starting to hear about it. So Olcott decides, I'm going to go because it's not far from New York City and I'm going to see what's going on. So he goes up there and he's witnessing these strange apparitions and these mediumistic seances that are taking place. And out of nowhere, this incredible woman walks in, and it's Blavatsky, who's also heard about this from reading his articles. And this is where they meet, and this is how they will kind of create this whole scenario of the Theosophical Society. But one thing that I think is interesting to note is that Olcott will say a number of strange things happened when she showed up that weren't happening before. Suddenly the room became, it sounds like, walking into a movie theater. All these apparitions are showing up as soon as Blavatsky gets there. And, ostensibly all this is happening so people can understand things better about the spiritual world. And this was the move of the mystery schools. But it's the tail end of this wild wave of spiritualism that started in 1848 with the Fox sisters and brings us to this period of 1875 when these two very important people meet. And they have a kind of an interesting back and forth, and they correspond for a little longer, and then they become lifelong partners, not romantic, but business partners, and they are foundation partners. That is, they build this entire movement of the Theosophical Society together, and he's a crucial link, Olcott, because he's American. We have to remember that she's coming over here from Russia. She could be viewed as an enemy spy. She could be viewed in a lot of different ways, never mind her very unusual esoteric mystery school ideas. So one of the interesting things that happens along the way is, I just want to read actually Olcott's description of Blavatsky before we get into that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We're going deep on the Theosophical Society and Helena Blavatsky's relation to the Hotzone, which we're getting into here. And I want to remind everyone that you're going to be, we'll take questions in the second half of the program. So make sure that you ask them all in caps. And Miss Olivia will be taking the questions, and we'll put them all together and answer anything that you have, and keep it Hotzone and Blavatsky related. I already see a lot of good questions out there tonight. And it's a great crowd. And oddly enough, as we recounted, it is in fact the 144th anniversary of the founding of the Theosophical Society. Certainly a powerful date. There was something else about today, which is it is the anniversary date of John and Jacqueline Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
Beautiful pictures of them.
What is it that's going on with this date, September 13th?
It's interesting that they would choose September 13th for a wedding anniversary. I've been asking myself that today.
9/13.
Why would you do that?
We must have a numerologist in the audience who can give us kind of a heads up on that one. So, a quick note from Olcott about meeting Blavatsky. After knowing this remarkable lady and seeing the wonders that occur in her presence, I'm almost tempted to believe the stories of Eastern fables are but simple, that they are simple narratives of fact, and that this very American outbreak of spiritualistic phenomena is under the control of an order. It's a very important point. While depending for its results upon unseen agents, this order has its existence upon earth among humanity. This is important. Olcott has figured it out. The mystery schools had a battle because of the incredible scientific materialism coming down, as Steiner told us. That battle, the compromise figure out of that battle is Blavatsky. They say, okay, she's got the ability, we'll reveal it all through her. And we'll back off of this spiritualism because we're actually giving the wrong message, and it's becoming fraught with all kinds of people who shouldn't be involved in it. Now, it's very interesting because when we look at Blavatsky's life, she, over time, will be guided by different masters who will show her, you need to go to New York, you need to do this. And as I told you, a number of her activities took her around the globe, all the way from Tibet to Peru to New Mexico to New York, and into the Hotzone in Cuba, that we find something remarkable is happening with these masters guiding her. Now, one of the masters who is known to guide Blavatsky is a very mysterious figure named Kuthumi. And he is an ascended master. But this Kuthumi, at times, very strangely and very enigmatically, is referred to as John King by Blavatsky herself. Now, this figure John King shows up in a number of mediumistic circles. That is, a number of mediums are getting contacted by this John King. He's almost like the celebrity among these medium seances. But as her teacher, he actually has an incredible role with her that she describes, and we'll get into that. But let's take a quick look at her painting now of John King and what this name will mean as we get along. This is John King. Bearded, reading some kind of important mystical book. We have the X steganography right there in that early version of the Theosophical logo, which we'll take a closer look at here. And this just gives us a real snapshot of this master. Now, before we go any further, let's take a look at a comparison with this John King, who shows up in someone named Dr. Child's narratives about spirits from going to these mediumistic seances. Someone put them side by side, and they look exactly the same. So something very unusual going on with this John King character. Well, the John King character is revealed to be a pirate, and reveals himself to be a pirate named Henry Morgan. Now, Henry Morgan is a historical personage who was made a knight by the British Crown, and who operated in the Hotzone, and one of his famous battles was taking over Cuba and becoming the Governor General of Jamaica. Someone who had an uncanny ability to predict things and to be a leader. And so, but hardly would seem like somebody you would say is a kind of ascended master. So there's something very odd going on with the story in Henry Morgan, and Steiner picks up on this too, which I'm going to read. This is the Theosophical logo. And let's take a quick look here. This is the same X that we see at the top, and the X steganography there is actually a sun wheel in Tibetan folklore. And it's a deep mystery school symbol that will later be appropriated, as we know, by the Nazis, but turned in a different fashion, turned the other way. We have here the Egyptian Ankh in the middle of this, and what appears to be the Star of David, and then that's the Kukulkan sign of a snake eating itself, which shows up over and over again in mystery traditions throughout Central and South America. And then in French here, but there is no religion higher than truth. That's their motto. This is what the Theosophical Society is founded with. And again, in terms of steganography, the X steganography is right in the heart of the mystery schools using it. And although I've referred very often on this program to X steganography in terms of moving projects through government agencies and things particularly related to aerospace, they got all that, that is the forces that were doing that, they got all that from watching the mystery schools and knowing that the X steganography had gone all the way back to Pythagoras, and before that to the Book of the Dead. And that these groups would use the X steganography as an indicator, as like a flashpoint, a snapshot. So I just want to give us a quick look at some X steganography here. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep into the Hotzone with the founder of the Theosophical Society, Helena Blavatsky. And Miss Olivia, what's going on over there?
God, there are so many great questions and things that I don't know anything about.
That's good. Well, we're all going to learn something tonight. I think there's no question that I can see some good questions going on there. Some of these, I want to refer to some of this X steganography that we see, make it really kind of see-through. So let's take a look at some of these figures, and I'm looking for the one of Kukulkan. This is Kukulkan in Mayan mythology, and he is really the leader of the Mayan culture, and he embodies the X steganography. He in fact operates within it, and unusually there's this eye that is in the middle of his belt there, and the X steganography is quite, if we study Kukulkan and the various things that we see in relation to him, over and over again the X steganography shows up in the Mayan work. Now, the X itself, and the very reason why we have the X steganography series, is these groups kept the X to refer to something. And what they were referring to was this advanced ability and this event that had happened in Atlantean times, and they had held over the memory and the technology of it from ancient periods, and also the incredible spiritual abilities that went with it. So that is where exteganography comes from. And later, it was revealed in this period of the, Middle Ages by someone named Johannes Trithemius, the abbot of Sponheim, most perfect master of natural magic. And he described it as steganography, that is, the sure art of disclosing the intention of one's mind to those who are absent through secret writing. So in other words, I can be looking at something and it can look like a normal text, but because I have this ability to read the steganography that's embedded in it, I have the ability of an initiate, basically, then I know what it is. But it is public, so it's out there, anyone can see it. It's like the pyramids or Notre Dame. For an initiate, they can read it. Now, when I think about exteganography, it's so crucial in Theosophy that they have it embedded in the logo. And this is something that got distorted later by other groups, but let's keep that in mind, that they are bringing the exteganography public in the very heart and the very logo. I want to show another factor in relation to the Theosophical logo, which is, I mentioned something about that. It looks pretty much like the Star of David in the middle. But there's not a lot of Judeo-Christian symbolism in Theosophy. So what is that doing there? And this is quite interesting. We talk a lot on this program about something called the Two-Eye Stone. Now, the Two-Eye Stone is something that Edgar Cayce, the famous medium, seer, psychic, sleeping prophet, introduced to the culture. And it's spelled Tuaoi. Tuaoi. Two-Eye. The Two-Eye Stone was what the Atlanteans used for their powering their cities. And it had the ability, it sounds very much like a solar energy, because it is the ability of concentrating through the prisms of crystal this incredible light. And that light can do anything from, they powered their flying machines and all the advances in technology that they had in that period. Cayce spoke about it and said it also had other abilities, that the Two-Eye Stone had the ability, for example, for these priestesses to connect with higher spiritual entities from the outer spheres. So it was a direct connection spiritually. It's like opening up your laptop and suddenly there's an ascended master in there. Think of it that way. So there were groups in Atlantis that were using it that way, and there was another group that came along, which is an Ahrimanic group. As the Steiner people call it Ahriman, the Cayce people call it Belial. And that group started to use the crystal in a totally different fashion. Now, there was a NASA engineer who became fascinated with the Cayce readings. And he decided, I'm going to actually lay out this two-eye crystal the way Cayce described it in the readings that these people of Atlantis supposedly had, and let's see if it holds up. So he made a diagram of the Two-Eye Stone and started to see that it was the outline of a laser. Then he went a little bit further, and he took from the actual Cayce description and the records of the readings, he built a model of what that Two-Eye Stone looked like. And there it is, lo and behold. This crystal, which would eventually cause this great destruction in Atlantis, would become the reason why they would use the exteganography after the fact. But here's the most important piece, I think. The most important piece of the puzzle is the very top of the Two-Eye Stone is that same Theosophical logo, Star of David. Something very significant about this. And I think when we look at it from the Theosophical side, we see a black triangle going in one direction and a white triangle going in another, which gives us another hint about using dark matter energy and using basically this kind of higher solar energy.
Though,
yes.
Is that they are intertwined, they are tangled.
Yes.
In a way, it reminds me of the yin-yang symbol. right?
Yes,
And
right.
that you
It
can't
is.
have one without the other.
Indeed.
And of course, this is the Merkaba.
Yes, and it's the light side is harnessing the dark energy, which I think is important too, because it's the one that's pointing up.
Actually, it would be a great thing. You know, there's a lot of debate, intellectual debate about what the symbol means.
Yes.
But it would be a great idea, and I think Gigi would suggest this, that we all meditate on it and find the answers for ourselves.
Oh, there's no question about it. Yeah, I've definitely sent this logo to Gigi to spend a little time with, and she's come up with amazing things about the two-eye stone. I do hope, actually, she's exactly. I think when it comes to the two-eye stone, like we can understand it on a few levels. We can understand it scientifically. So we have these guys who are NASA engineers trying to reproduce it, take a look at it. You know, we've heard them do that with things like Ezekiel's wheel or the Ark of the Covenant. You know, when Graham Hancock was here, we had a long conversation. His first major book was about the Ark of the Covenant. And this is something which a lot of directions about how it was built and the dimensions and the type of wood and the gold and the metals that were used and how nobody could touch it, that show very advanced scientific knowledge. So when we look at the two-eye stone now, we're looking at the Star of David and the Theosophical Society, and it's all embedded there directly in the Casey readings. Let's think about that. We go directly from Theosophy, directly into the Casey readings. There is that arc between the two. And what was it that Casey said? Well, he said the Atlanteans had used the power crystal to destroy themselves. And this is what happened. The original group on Atlantis, there were two groups. One was Amelia's, the other one was Belial. And what happened, according to Casey, was the Amelia's group was using the power source for a spiritual purpose. The Belial group wanted to use it basically as a laser to take over other territories and dominate. And so it was the Amelia's group that preserved the information and took it into different places and hid the information, the Hall of Records. That's where all this comes from. And it's largely, that they go to different places on Earth. One of those places is Egypt, one of those places is Mexico, and the other place is South America. So we start to get a real picture of what they're talking about, and we're going to read the Theosophical version, which actually gives a specific date, 9,564 BC, for the sinking of Atlantis, which is very close to Casey's 10,000 BC. Yes?
Okay, so Najat was asking, do you know what kind of crystal the two-eye stone was made of?
Well, in terms of the kinds of crystal, it's interesting because he talks about
Is it manufactured crystal or is it natural crystal?
No, it's certainly natural crystal that is polished down to 6 sides.
So would it be quartz?
It's definitely quartz, but I'll tell you, when he talks about it, he also refers to the white stone, and we also hear it called as the firestone. And that seems to be the more miniaturized version of it. So I think whenever you get into the Casey readings, there's a degree of interpretation that needs to take place. Okay, so we've now seen that the Theosophical Society is holding the two-eye stone right in their logo. And when we start to get into this figure of Blavatsky taking this forward, wow. She's bringing back this ancient mystery school knowledge. So there's something very, very unusual about what we mentioned earlier, all about this Morgan character. And again, throughout Central America and throughout Mexico, we see these remnants of Atlantis and the culture, and they are snapshots of that culture. Also with Viracocha, which Blavatsky was in Peru studying, long before she started the Theosophical Society, we have, again, an incredible spiritual force, this God coming down, showing them agriculture, showing them advanced knowledge, showing them advanced astronomy. And if we just stop and we don't jump to the, hey, aliens came down and gave us that information, we can start to think of this a little bit differently, which is there's a higher access of knowledge that these groups hold, and that when we hold our consciousness on a certain place, we have access to that knowledge. So it's kind of a good way, I think, for us to look at it. Yes, what do you got, Mr. Leader?
Well, this is a big question, but I think you can answer it quickly.
I'm sorry.
Cat I Am was asking, explain the Akashic records, please. And
Oh,
this
yeah.
might be a good moment to do that.
Yeah, well, this is something, it's interesting because the Theosophical Society brought this concept forward, and it was enhanced by anthroposophy and certainly by the Casey readings. And this is the idea that written upon upon time and space is a record of the thoughts and the events that have transpired. And that those who are initiates can tap into those records, kind of like a library resource, and read them. And what's interesting is sometimes when they ask these questions in the readings for Casey, when they're like, well, how did Plato, this story and so on, and he gets the story from different people. But Casey makes the point that Plato could read the Akashic record. So if he's getting this story from the Egyptian priests, he can go in there and check it out himself. So the idea of the Akasha is that it's there, and if you are sufficiently attuned, you can go back there and retrocognitively read it. Now, as far out as that sounds, let's think about some of the amazing things that we've seen, for example, with Blavatsky or with Casey, predicting certain things. Casey predicted when the Bimini Wall would rise up and said it was part of the Poseidia temple in Atlantis that was rising. So he predicted the date 68 and 69, and that's when we found the Bimini Wall. I mean, this ability exists, and the way that theosophy or the way anthroposophy would read it is, it can be subject to the person who's reading it. So, it is interesting in that sense. But there's no question that the idea would be you'd have to be at a very elevated, initiated level in these mystery schools to have that ability, for sure. So, yeah, that's kind of a snapshot of it. I highly recommend theosophical literature on the Akashic record because it's excellent. Okay, so we come around to something very interesting, which is by the time we get to Sir Francis Bacon, we are in an unusual situation where Bacon puts out a book called The New Atlantis, where it's talking about this incredible enlightened culture, and everyone thinks he's talking about this is what America should be because it's around 1500, and we've just discovered America. And oddly enough, another just quick steganography thing before we jump off here. This is Christopher Columbus's esoteric signature, and it starts with this X. No one knows what the signature means. And they don't understand why he did things like, signed the Pope's grave with it, for example. But the X at the very beginning of it gives us an idea that it is associated with this X steganography. It's part of that footprint that this group leaves as it moves along. Now, a lot of people have pointed to Columbus's links with the Knights Templar also. And it is quite fascinating because the Knights Templar, over and over again, there are people who study the hooked X involved with their visits over to America pre-Columbus. And even though they are kind of, by the time Columbus rolls around, their leaders have been taken out, etc., he doesn't, in fact, fly a Templar flag, which is something that Professor Farrell, or Dr. Joseph Farrell told me. So we start to get kind of a picture with these individuals. Just to bring this all up to date, I found something very interesting, which was that they were taking this book list for Elon Musk, of all people, and he was going through this book list, and I was like, yeah, that book, okay, this book, that book. And then in the middle of it, let's see if I actually have that here, in the middle of it jumps out The New Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon. And also, he wants this very special version of it. So we can see this idea of New Atlantis is inextricably linked up with the X steganography. And there's the owner of SpaceX and SpaceX.com. And in his book list of his favorite book is New Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon. So we have to understand how this relates. And I'm going to read this just because I mentioned it. That is Musk there. And of course, Musk has got himself into trouble at times when he mouthed off about certain things, and now he's more in line. So SpaceX is going forward, but we'll see. So he goes along and he's talking about these different books that he's into. And then it goes, in this article, on most Mondays, Elon Musk reads his original 1627 edition of Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. On most Mondays. Do you have a book that you read every Monday, Miss Olivia?
No, I do not.
Kind of interesting. I mean, I refer back to books a lot, like Knowledge of Higher Worlds or In Search of the Miraculous, but every Monday. According to him, it contains critical marginalia from an anonymous 17th century pragmatist. He refrains from adding his own concerns, not out of respect, but because Elon Musk has a thing about touching pens. So I won't go any further with that, but we can see this tie-over from people who were looking for this new Atlantis and expecting Atlantis to rise to the modern technologists, the real kind of people in the arena on this. They're still citing it and still going back to this concept of New Atlantis. So when we backtrack it to how Theosophy sees Atlantis and their version of it, this is quite important because before Theosophy, the idea of Atlantis, pretty much all that we had was this Bacon notion and what Plato had left us. There were minor stabs in the dark along this line, but nothing substantial. And then with Theosophy, the advent of Theosophy comes in 1881, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which is written by a senator from Minnesota named Ignatius Donnelly, who runs for vice president, by the way. So now we're seeing this political tie-in to Atlantis very early, 1881. So when I refer to it later, and we're seeing things like the Kennedy administration involved with getting Ernest Hemingway's material out of Cuba, we can see that this is a long track. You know, 1520 is the Bacon book. That's a long ways off, but it's still being cited. So I think we have to kind of keep that in mind as we move along down this Atlantis track, so we understand when Theosophy is bringing forward Atlantis back to the public consciousness, it's to recapture something that's dormant, that's latent in our unconscious memory, a collective memory about Atlantis, which goes deeper and further and gets us into the incredible technology that they possessed. So this technology and their abilities, they're said to have acted like gods, for example, causes something. It causes such a disruption when their civilization goes down, that this extegonography is the root, is the thing that survives after the fact, and it means that no longer can these abilities be given just to anyone. It is only the initiates who can hold the information and help basically the public behind the scenes until the public gets to a point and the general group of society gets to the point where this knowledge can be shared and they can use it intelligently, and that one group won't solicit and exploit another group. So it's a very tall order, but I think when we look at the cosmology that's being brought forward in Theosophy, we're starting to get the idea. I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. By the way, go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and that keeps us on track with each other. And basically the way that works is about once a week on Friday, we're going to send you out the newsletter, tell you all about the show and the guests that we have coming up. We have such exciting interviews coming up that, you know, it's going to be a remarkable fall, I'll put it to you that way. And you're definitely going to want to be a subscriber to that newsletter. While you're there, subscribe to the site. We've made it incredibly affordable. And it's something that you need to do to get behind the site and the work that we're doing here. So much good work out there, and you know, we need to get behind it and really do the things to make it count. And my thing about 2019 has been, you know, apathy isn't it. You're really getting involved is really important, and I think showing the support for the things that are getting those answers out there is crucial. So go to darkjournalist.com and do that, and sign up for the newsletter. Okay, before I move now into Henry Morgan, who, as we learned earlier, is John King, who will direct so much of Blavatsky's life. How are we doing out there?
Doing great. I just wanted to throw this out there.
Yes.
Underwater, said, I've seen what people call the Akashic records. Looks nothing like you would think. It was an incredible energy stream connected to the earth and every human who ever existed. Life-changing moment. So I asked how that happened.
Oh, yeah.
And Underwater said, it was an OBE. I've never been able to do it consciously again. I do get dreams, though. This is fascinating.
That's out-of-body experience. That's really fascinating. I have heard of sensitives and psychics getting in touch with this Akashic flow, and supposedly there's something in there about, in esoteric language, about the silver cord. And I've heard before that that silver cord now is the connection point between the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, and the cells of the Leydig center in the body. So that's where the silver cord idea, this is what the ancients knew. But we can only imagine somebody actually reading the Akashic. That sounds fascinating. And accounts like that, it makes you wonder about the incredible abilities that people have. Let's talk a little bit about Henry Morgan. Henry Morgan is around in the 17th century. He is someone who becomes known as an excellent military planner. He's used by the King of England, Charles, to basically help control and really kind of get areas in the Hotzone, like Cuba, like Jamaica, and this whole kind of Bahamas region, so that they are really under the crown. Now, he's simultaneously known as someone who's very organized. They were saying strange things about him that, when he kept prisoners under very good conditions, and he would always be democratically elected as captain, and he sounds like someone from an order. Let's start with that, very interestingly. But also, there's a trail of destruction in his wake later, and a book comes out in 1678 by one of his buccaneers who says, this guy did this, he, in order that we wouldn't get attacked at certain outposts, he used nuns and priests as hostages and things like that. So not a very pretty picture. Very unusual character, but he is really the myth of the real pirate who is under, he's kind of like an early James Bond, because he's working on behalf of the government. So he's not just someone who shows up and hijacks a boat. He's not that kind of a pirate. There are other stories about him that he had unusual abilities, that, these kind of psychic abilities gave him the ability to predict in battle and so on. One of the more interesting things that I found, which was that J.P. Morgan claimed kinship with him and created a boat called J.P. Morgan's pirate ship. And that's just from that article there. Quite interesting. But I'll read a little bit from this. They say the beginnings of Morgan's pirate fantasy, of course, J.P. Morgan, the incredible financier who ultimately sabotaged free energy in America by shutting down Nikola Tesla's work. Quote, Morgan felt like a pirate all his life. His savvy Wall Street deals made him fierce, and his last name gave him kinship with the pirate Henry Morgan, the Morgans of Wales. I'm not sure how closely connected he was. I've tried to find that, but he certainly thought he was. When he had enough cash, he built a gigantic yacht, and he kept the theme going. J.P. Morgan's pirate ship. The Corsair II was built in 1891. In case you didn't know, Corsair is a word for a foreign pirate. Ironically, Henry Morgan was offended when he was once called one, the original Henry Morgan. Morgan had a few ships, J.P. Morgan had a few ships, Corsair 1 through 4, that took the famous name. In addition to the name, Morgan had the bottom of the ship painted black. I always thought this was interesting. Some very unusual things about J.P. Morgan as we look into him. One of the things is that he didn't like to be photographed, and there's a famous picture of him fighting a photographer because he's getting his picture taken. It seems like an unusual thing for such a pirate. The fate of the Corsair II might even be more interesting than Morgan's fantasies. His pirate ship became a Navy vessel. Morgan's impressive ship was sold to the government for battle in the Spanish-American War, seeing combat near Cuba in 1898. So the Morgans came back to Cuba. Henry Morgan had taken it over as early as the 1660s, and now they were back. I found that very interesting. The Navy kept the ship through World War I before selling it back to Morgan. So he wanted a piece of it again. I think that gives us a hint that there's something a little bit deeper with this Morgan King story in Theosophy, and that's where we're going next. But what is outstanding, and of course Olivia got a big kick out of, is that this Morgan, Henry Morgan, who shows up so deeply as a spirit in spiritualistic seance circles through the 1860s and 70s, basically the celebrity of those circles, and then shows up as a major figure around Theosophy, is the same Captain Morgan that they now base Captain Morgan's spiced rum on.
Original spiced rum.
It just makes you want to have some lemonade, doesn't it? It really does. But you can see that we're going in a very interesting direction here because there's no denying it. Henry Morgan is identified as John King in the spiritualistic circles, and he recounts his entire life as a pirate. He talks about how his mother was a medium and how he had these psychic abilities which gave him this incredible ability. And he talks and gives these stories out to Henry Olcott and to this Dr. Childs, who records them in a book. Now, jumping in a little bit further, in the 1870s, there was a big, and I mean, spirituality and the spiritualism wave created everything from Ouija boards and all the rest of it. But there was a real craze associated with this. And one of the things that was important for them was the case of Katie King. Now, Katie King was the daughter of this John King, a.k.a. Henry Morgan the Pirate. You still with me? Let's take a look. This is
we've been talking about this, and I'm still blown away by this. It's crazy.
It's remarkable. And we have to get to the root of it to start to get how, remember, the mystery schools are plugging in the spiritualism movement. So they're giving it, all along, they're giving us these hints, and some of the things that explode in the public in the 1860s and 70s were there, because they were desperate to move these secrets public. Now, this is a picture, a phantom spirit picture from the 1870s, I kid you not, of Katie King. This was taken during one of these seances. Now, what happened basically was John King and Katie King, in manifesting during these mediumistic seances, were such regular figures in these circles that they were literally becoming spook celebrities. They were the ghosts that were big on the circuit. But what was all this? Why Henry Morgan? Why John King? Why Katie King? So we're going to have to dig into this a little bit. And let's take a little look at his relationship, that is John King, Henry Morgan's relationship with Helena Blavatsky, of all people. Okay, quickly, Sir Henry Morgan, Welsh Buccaneer. Okay. His typical encyclopedia entry. Born in 1635 in Cardiff, Wales. Died 1688 in Jamaica. By the way, his body disappeared.
Just throwing that in there.
How about that? Welsh Buccaneer, most famous of the adventurers who plundered Spain's Caribbean colonies during the 17th century. That's it. He was operating against Spain all of that time. I mean, that's, he was under that cloak there. So he wasn't just, in a wanton fashion going after these. He was basically sabotaging Spain for Britain. Operating with the unofficial support of the English government, he undermined Spanish authority in the West Indies. Morgan's origins and early career are obscure. He was probably a member of the expedition that in 1655 seized Jamaica from the Spanish and converted it. He participated in an expedition against Cuba in 1662. This is really when they took it over. And the Second Anglo-Dutch War. He was second in command of buccaneers operating against Dutch colonies in the Caribbean. Okay, he has access to all this. So he has access to Cuba, he has access to the Bahamas, he has access to Bimini. Selected commander of the Buccaneers in 1668, Morgan quickly captured Puerto Principe, Cuba, and in an extraordinarily daring move, stormed and sacked a well-fortified city, Portobello, in Panama. Now, this is all really remarkable achievement, and he's remembered as a pirate because he wasn't going as traditional military. He was doing these things kind of James Bondish. We know there was another James Bond type character working for the Queen in the figure of John Dee, who, that's where 007 comes from. But I think what's interesting is both of these individuals seem to possess incredible psychic abilities, especially in the case of Dee. Of course, he's the Queen's conjurer. But also in the case of Henry Morgan, his abilities come full circle, and later as a spirit he will discuss what that's all about. All right, a little more about Morgan. So basically, I'm going to get through the bloody history here. He basically, when he takes over Panama, England arrests him. And they're like, oh, we have a treaty with Spain, you shouldn't have done that, etc. So he kind of falls out of favor after that. But nonetheless, 2 years later, he's knighted by King Charles II. So he's a knight. And Morgan sent him, Charles II sent Morgan out again as deputy governor of Jamaica, where he lived as a wealthy, respected planter until his death. Now, while he's gone, his daughter Katie dies, and she becomes in the spirit world, basically. And so then he dies. And what happens, oddly enough, is they start showing up at these seances in 1870, 1871, and by the time we get around to the Eddy Farm in Vermont, John King is pretty much the mediumistic circle spook. He's the one that people are looking for to show up at these seances and tell me more about the spiritual world. Now, we have to get into the things that Blavatsky had to say about King, and it's quite remarkable. Some of these are from a very interesting book called Madame Blavatsky Revisited, which I want to make note is good reference material. Joseph Howard Tyson, and I certainly will cite a few things there from him. Yes.
Okay, Walter Bosley just came into
Hey,
the chat,
Walter.
and he said, Daniel must spend every friggin' waking moment in research. And it is very much true.
Walter knows the feeling, actually. And I've been reading, and I'm almost done now with Esoteric Napoleon, which is a fantastic book by Walter Bosley, which gets deep into a lot of the things that we're talking about, but really gets into the esoteric mystery school side of Napoleon and his campaigns. And I highly recommend that book. And we're going to have Walter on. We're going to talk about having him on here later this month. So Walter, it's great to see you out there. Now, I do find something interesting about King and Morgan, which is this John King starts identifying himself as Henry Morgan, the pirate. And then Steiner makes note that, isn't it interesting that this Kuthumi, who is the leader of master figure for Blavatsky, morphs into this very strange John King, Henry Morgan Buccaneer guy. There's a picture of Kuthumi, who is a religious master, one of the ascended masters that led Blavatsky to New York to start the Theosophical Society. So his getting merged in with this Morgan character is very, very unusual. And it doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. And yet, through her own discussions with Olcott, over and over again, Blavatsky is discussing this John King as her spirit guide. Now, a few things about this. The disembodied spirit John King figured significantly in Madame Blavatsky's life between 1874 and 1876. She affirmed that he functioned as her guardian, as well as messenger for the masters. Messenger. Most mediums identified him with the spirit of Welsh privateer Henry Owen Morgan, who we just discussed. memorialized today by Captain Morgan's spiced rum. Well, there you go. This hardy buccaneer atoned for his earthly misdeeds by aiding humanity from the astral plane. And so when he shows up at these seances, he says, I had all these spiritual abilities, I misused them, and it was Katie King, my daughter, who on the spiritual plane helped me to realize this, and now I'm here to help you. Now it's 200 years later, and all these spiritualistic circles are open, and I'm explaining what going through God's other door is all about. It's very interesting and unusual. Okay, so Blavatsky hinted that Cairo's Fraternity of Luxor, which is one of these mystery schools, animated this hardy pirate's etheric shell in order to progress mankind spiritually. This is a weird thing to do. At other times, she referred to John as a generic character, implying that he represented more than one personality. Also unusual. Henry Olcott suspected that John King was a humbugging elemental worked by Blavatsky like a marionette and used as a help toward my education. That's Olcott speaking, unquote. Blavatsky described the etheric remains of dead humans as, quote, simulacra of men and women made up wholly of terrestrial passions, vices, worldly thoughts, of the residuum of the personality that was. In other words, on the astral plane, you have the actual personality, the actual soul, and then when they move on, there's a shell left behind. If they were particularly worldly, if they were materialistic, then it kind of holds those qualities. And what she's saying, in a sense, here as we go along, is that someone who's a master can reanimate one of these personalities for any reason, to show up and do anything. So they can reanimate, William Shakespeare to show up in a mediumistic setting. But for some reason, it looks like John King, Henry Morgan, is being animated according to Olcott, who, remember, is her really close companion through all this. He's saying that she's the one who's doing it. So it gets very interesting because this character, remember, is going around to all these mediumistic circles and giving them this depiction of the spiritual world. So is this part of her mission? It could very well be. Let's keep going. That marionette statement, I think, is really interesting from Olcott, so we're not going to forget that. The deceased shed their mortal shells before moving to Devachan, which is heaven. These half-intelligent shells with memory but no creativity hang about the astral plane. Accomplished mediums, such as Blavatsky, could galvanize such entities by projecting their own astral bodies onto them. This is Olcott's thinking. And what's interesting is, although he's close with Blavatsky, he's wondering what happened and how this John King got in the picture. and how do we mix up John King with ascended masters? It's an unusual thing to do. So she goes on to recount to Olcott some unusual things that this character, Henry Morgan, did as John King, doing these things like writing letters and so on and so forth. Now, in this period, Olcott makes this statement, quote, a certain wonderful psychophysiological change happened to Blavatsky that I am not at liberty to speak about. So give us, that's a complete mystery. Something about her working around this John King is giving her an incredible psychophysiological change.
We take a second?
Yeah,
There's a little confusion. Okay?
Yes.
So Najat says, so wait.
Yes.
Is Daniel saying that Blavatsky is Henry Morgan or John King? Is this and? Tessa1111 said, Gigi said spirit guides are us in a parallel timeline. Blavatsky's King was her in another time.
Oh, that's interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be. It can very well be. Here's the traditional thing. It's not. We're uncorking something that doesn't have the answers so well defined, but we're going to take a crack at it. What happens with this is simply that in mediumistic circles, this John King shows up. And I've shown you that the picture of John King is exactly the same John King that Blavatsky drew. And I think that photo, Olivia, can you go through that and get me that photo? I know it's
Which
in there.
photo are you looking at?
It is the John King photo. Here, just take that. It's in there. You know, the one with the X.
Okay.
So John King is showing up throughout this spiritualistic craze that's sweeping America. And he's showing up in these seances. And there's one more. That one.
These guys?
Yes, thank you. Oh, gracias, señorita. Muchas gracias. So he shows up and he's giving these diatribes. And there's a wonderful book by Dr. Childs, which is basically just John King talking his head off with Katie King, his daughter, from the spirit realm. And it was the result of all these different mediumistic things. Now, what's wild about this is there's a group, a couple called the Holmeses in Philadelphia. And they are very much like the top of the line in terms of medium craft. And people come from all over to see the different spiritual circles that they create. And what happens is they are the ones who develop this picture of Katie King, and John King shows up over and over again. So out of nowhere, someone attempts to unmask them as, you know, this is an act, that's an actress, those photos aren't real, and try to debunk them and all the rest of it. And strangely, it is Henry Olcott and Blavatsky who come to their rescue. This is really quite remarkable because getting involved with that was tricky enough, but also to put their own reputations on the line to do it. And also, again, remembering Blavatsky's connection with this John King, Henry Morgan character. This gets very, very deep. So the Holmes become the case to try to kind of get rid of mediumistic shamanism and the spiritualist circles by saying it's all a fraud and all the rest of it. And what Blavatsky basically puts out there is that one of these left-hand schools is trying to destroy the credibility of what John and Katie King are bringing forward. So it's quite interesting, and I think that we have to look at it as something that Olcott said earlier, which is that in this spiritualistic movement of the mediums, of table rapping, of the spirits coming through and us becoming aware of these spirits, and the spiritual world and life after death and things like this, and reincarnation, we are looking at the mystery schools consciously impacting the consciousness of regular, everyday society to try to move it up to a level where it acknowledges the spiritual plane from a different level than just a dogmatic religious level, and also from getting it away from the scientific materialism, which is sweeping in, that says there's no God, it's just what we can measure, forget all that stuff, and you don't have any spiritual identity, you are just, impulses in a brain, basically. So that is going to be so overpowering and so damning to the souls of so many people that they have to find a way out. And the mystery school solution is to let all this information out, but it comes out in these kind of crazy, fantastic ways. That's where the John King, Katie King information comes from. Now, its association with Blavatsky is what grabs me here, because remember his deep association with the Hotzone. I've already pointed out that Blavatsky, long before she started Theosophy, was in Cuba, was in the Bahamas, and actually was instructed by her masters to go to Cuba. So here we have Blavatsky right in the heart of it. And what will Theosophy say later? Is Blavatsky says, well, land has to rise. The Atlantean land has to rise. The next root race, that's where they're going to operate, basically. And it's inevitable. So we get this hint of land rising. Later in the work of psychic Edgar Cayce, what does he talk about? He talks about land rising. Land rising off the East Coast in the figure of this Bimini temple, this Poseidon temple. Well, what did he say about it? He said that the Poseidon Temple held the records that were the same records that are under the right paw of the Sphinx in Egypt. And that it would be the first wave of the rise. Well, who was there? Ernest Hemingway. Who else was there? Nixon, Martin Luther King, and all the rest of it. So if you watch the program, you know that there's something very special going on in that hot zone between Bimini and Cuba. And it relates to these ruins being found and land rising. We've also pointed out that there's a series of figures who have bought lots there. And that goes all the way back to Ernest Hemingway's brother. They'll buy lots in the Atlantic Ocean for when this land rises. And so that when it does, they can claim it, or they can claim what's on it. And in the meantime, they're doing incredible underwater excavations to get at that. Now, as I pointed out in this program, the oceanographer Helena in 2001 found the Cuban city underwater. And those are her pictures of it. I mean, this is a city that could easily be an Egyptian or a Mayan city. And these aren't just a few ruins, according to Zalitsky, who I've spoken to and corresponded with. It's as big as a metropolitan area. So it's large-scale ruins. And her findings were discussed by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the rest of it. All the articles are out there. But it was ultimately, according to her, the Cuban Navy that made her leave. So they've had those ruins now to themselves since 2008. That's 11 years. They've probably done a lot with it when you think about it. So quite remarkable for a number of reasons. That is Ernest Hemingway's brother pointing to New Atlantis. Well, this is where Atlantis is going to rise. Why does Ernest Hemingway's brother think Atlantis is going to rise in the hot zone? And, we've done a number of episodes on that, and I recommend them if you want to get some real answers about why that is. But ultimately, to make it kind of wrap it up in a neat shell for everyone, the Casey family and the Hemingways were very close. And Hemingway's presence in Bimini can be tracked directly back to readings from Edgar Casey that his mother asked him to do on Ernest Hemingway. It's quite remarkable. So that tie and what's going on there, again, we're getting levels of what happens in the hot zone. So let's go back to Blavatsky now. Blavatsky is saying John King is giving me all this information, all this guidance. John King, the name, this figure, identifying himself as Henry Morgan, this pirate, from the Buccaneer times, is showing up in all these spiritualistic seances. And now Katie King comes along, and she is giving all these diatribes in these medium sessions. And there's a group of mediums called the Holmes in Philadelphia. And this is the story that I'm describing, where Blavatsky shows up and says, to their rescue, no, they're not liars. So it's interesting for a lot of reasons, because it looks like when the mystery schools try to get information out to the public, when things go wrong or when they're attacked, in this case, Blavatsky said it's another group is coming in here to do that maliciously. So they're trying to knock this, whatever this is, this acknowledgement from the mystery schools out. Now, later, when they ask Olcott about it, what's the deal with John King? What he says is quite interesting. He says that, he's under the impression that it was Blavatsky all the time animating this kind of character for these mediumistic trances. Remember, when she went to the Eddy household, all the phenomena went off the charts. So he knew her. He knew she had this ability to project that powerfully. And so now we start to get it in mind, this is the mystery schools working through Blavatsky, creating this thing. And that's why she... it's like a teaching tool, and that's why she comes to the defense of this group who is interacting with this John King figure, and risks her own reputation to kind of save theirs. It's quite fascinating, and again, with Morgan's connections to the hot zone, we have to see, when we look at 300 lodges of the Theosophical Society in Cuba, this whole thing starts to wrap around the esoteric mystery schools, pointing to this area. this corridor. So we have geopolitical groups, we have the mystery schools, we have these amazing historical figures from Hemingway to Blavatsky, deeply, deeply involved in this area of the Hotzone and the mystery schools. I have more to lay out, but I'm going to start with Miss Olivia's questions.
There are so many, I always say this, but tonight it's really true. I am inundated with great questions. I don't know how I'm going to choose. Okay, so.
Yes.
Belialith. So there are good pirates and bad pirates? Let's start there.
I think it's interesting with Henry Morgan because he's not so much a pirate as he is a 007, because he's sent in under shadowy terms by the crown to control these areas, and he has almost an uncanny sense for how to do that. This is his weird psychic ability. Now, the explanation by Morgan, when he reappears as John King in these seances, is that after he died, he got this incredible epiphany of what he had misused his psychic abilities, and that he had to go through all this kind of cleansing and a kind of purgatory to reach this point where he'd come back and help everyone because he understood all these things. So it depends on how you look at it. It's sort of like a story of redemption, but it's got layers and elements that I think we can get a real snapshot of the mystery schools and how they like to create narratives, create parables for us to follow and learn from. But the presence of John King in the early mediumistic circles, and then his relationship cited over and over again to Blavatsky is it's undeniable, and it stands out there in a very enigmatic way because it doesn't add up. And when we think of Kuthumi and how he resembles so much this king, and Kuthumi is this holy man who is, about as far away from a pirate as you can get, there's just a strange correlation there. Are they animating this story to teach the public? It sounds like something like that is going on. Yes. Okay,
Cylindro Andromeda says, DJ, there's an article by Hindu early theosophist Mohini where he says Kuthumi is just a general name for one working in a particular white brotherhood line of action, the Kuthumpas.
Oh.
Very interesting.
That is interesting. Well, I'll tell you this. When it comes to the Ascended Masters, all of the traditions, anthroposophy, theosophy, and the Casey work, on some level the Gurdjieff work, although they were almost like the anti-theosophy mystery school teaching, they all fundamentally agree in the Ascended Master idea. Casey talks about the Great White Brotherhood and the work that they do. And again, the Great White, this is the spiritual wave. It doesn't relate to anything about race or anything like that. It is the master training ground for these advanced masters, and they move through the culture. They move the culture along in spiritual understanding. This is where so much of this work is coming from. So I think it's interesting of Kuthumi as a title. That certainly makes sense. But in theosophy, Blavatsky brought him forth as one of the Ascended Masters guiding her progress, along with Saint Germain and El Morya and others.
Interesting. Although at the same time, when you think about like Seth, with Seth Speaks, is not, although has a single name, like of an individual, it's actually a group of entities working in unison for a single cause. So it makes me wonder about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point.
So again, Cylindro Andromeda. It is said in theosophical circles that the spiritualist craze received its initial impulse from a Yucatan brotherhood. Any thoughts on that?
Well, if you cite that for me, you can send it to info@darkjournalist.com. I'd like to look at it.
Okay. Because, of course, you are not a theosophist, right?
I'm deep in theosophical literature, and I think that anyone who is into the true spirit of awakening that ancient knowledge is a theosophist. But in terms of what they call the Theosophical Society, I'm not a member.
Okay. Well, Glovarn was asking earlier, does DJ consider himself a theosophist or an anthroposophist?
Well, I think what I would have to do is say that both anthroposophy and theosophy inform my worldview. I don't belong to them as groups, but their literature has informed so much of the work that I do.
You're not much of a joiner. Neither am I. You're a maverick.
Unbelievable. Maverick, I like that. There's no question about it. I have a couple of explanations here from Steiner, who became interested in the John King aspect himself. I think this is important to just stop quickly on this one. Rudolf Steiner, who again is the head of anthroposophy, and he started spiritual science. And he came out, remember, it was Annie Besant who said, we need someone in Germany, and this guy is completely incredible. Let's have him run theosophy, basically, in Germany. And he had the largest chapter there, and he was her understudy. There's no question about it. I mean, he certainly was accomplished in his Goethe studies, and he'd already had mystical experience, and he was incredibly advanced. He was a professor, like 26 years old. So he was incredibly advanced academically, and accomplished. But I would say that it was theosophy that really, the Theosophical Society gave him the ability to teach from an occult level. So his esoteric teachings, bringing that forward, that's where he was able to do that. So here's what he says. He says that basically something had happened there and that there were some masks being used. I find this fascinating. So remember that Blavatsky had this trouble earlier where she said to these mystery schools, look, I know everything that you do. I want to join. And they said, you're a woman. The American one that had all this political intrigue. For some reason, she wanted to join that. Of course, there are mystery schools with women in them, but in that period, this particular mystery school did not admit women, and she wasn't having any of it. And they also were suspicious of her because she was from Russia. So what they were freaked out by her, and they decided, you know, what we have to do is put her in what they call occult imprisonment, where she would not be able to see her true insights, that she'd be given other insights, and she would be blocked. And they did it as a group. They had the power to do this, to kind of put her under a spell. So this is where we come in here with Steiner real quick. He says, the situation was now extremely difficult, tremendously difficult. For what had been undertaken to the world's attention to the existence of a spiritual world had in a certain respect to be withdrawn, in spite of the fact that spiritualism had many adherents. It was only materialistic now. It was sheer diversion. Scholarly persons who concerned themselves with it were those who wanted to get information in an educated way about a spiritual world. In addition, Blavatsky had made it clear to the American Lodge she had no intention whatever of withholding from the world what she knew. This is the most dangerous part. She's breaking the wall of secrecy. And she knew a great deal. And remember afterwards, what she has conveyed through her, she had any amount of audacity. So he's saying, you know, she was the one who was going to let these secrets out. Good advice is costly, as the saying goes. What was to be done? And now something happened on various occasions to Blavatsky. For parts of what I am saying today in this connection, I have said in other places. Occult imprisonment was brought about. Blavatsky was put into trance through acts of a kind that can be performed by only certain brothers. This was a high-level undertaking to get her to shut down. Miss Olivia, you hanging in there?
I had to block somebody.
There you go.
Like,
Yes.
ooh, what am I up to? Oh, whatever.
Yes, it's Olivia. Remember
What
what
am
I
I
said.
afraid of? Oh, dear God.
I always say this to three-letter agencies to use, who want to use four-letter words. You just met a five-star
No, it's not
spam
that.
general.
No. We, in the chat, we create
This is the ideas
vibe.
room.
This
It
is the ideas room. It's high vibes. We talk really mostly about the subject you're talking about.
Yes.
And if somebody is too distracting, if they're disrupted,
Yes.
they get put in the corner, and if they come back and they continue, they get blocked, and that's all there is to
Hey,
it.
listen.
And there's no conspiracy around that. It doesn't make me a CIA agent.
I think you're a micro moon agent. Let's face it. Okay, so what he's saying is that these groups had come forward to block her information. Now he's saying, this is a quote, "The occult knowledge was in her aura as the result of certain processes that were set in this way. But for a long time, everything in this aura was thrown back into her own soul. That is to say, she was possessed by this information and was to be imprisoned. She was to be isolated as far as the outer world and her occultism were concerned." This is a pretty huge undertaking by this group, which, remember, was neither completely dark nor light. And they had blocked Blavatsky and distorted so much of her teaching. This is after she wrote Isis Unveiled in 1877, but before she wrote The Secret Doctrine. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, Steiner seems to be saying that part of this is the John King thing. So let's see if that's true. So he says, he starts to talk about her and Colonel Olcott. And then he says, "Colonel Olcott has written a great deal about this individuality who came to her field of vision under the mask of an earlier individuality designated as Mahatma Kuthumi." So he's saying that this group that's keeping her in this kind of occult imprisonment from seeing things as they really are is using the image of Kuthumi like a mask in her when she's spiritually tuning in. "Colonel Olcott has written a great deal about Mahatma Kuthumi, among other things, that Kuthumi had declared what individuality was living in him. He had indicated that this John King by name, a powerful sea pirate of the 17th century." This is in Olcott's book, People from the Other World. That's the book I wanted to recommend to everyone for tonight. It really fills it out. But Steiner says, "In the Mahatma Kuthumi, therefore, do we have the spirit of a bold sea pirate of the 17th century. Then in the 19th century, he's involved in significant manifestations with the help of others, too. He does all kinds of unusual things. He brought teacups from distance away. He let all kinds of records be produced from Blavatsky's father, and so forth. From Colonel Olcott's account, therefore, it must be assumed that the bold pirate, that this is indeed the bold pirate of the 17th century. Now, Olcott speaks in a remarkable way about this John King. He says that perhaps here, of the spirit of this pirate is possibly the creation of an order, which, depending on its agents, has its existence among physical men. According to this account, Kuthumi might be created by the order, and might be the agent through which H.P. Blavatsky was bound up with all kinds of special interests that are specific and should be spread around the world. And this is how the Eastern mysticism becomes overpowering in Theosophy. So it's quite unusual the way that Steiner sees it, which is he's saying the whole John King thing is related to this occult imprisonment, and this is part of the misdirection that takes place. It is quite fascinating to contemplate King and the explosive nature of this kind of spiritualism circle celebrity showing up, and this is really the height of spiritualism at this period. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Well, that gives me a great opportunity to ask this question that came in early. Bethany Green. I was just thinking dangerously that maybe we are all in a psychic cage, just like Madame B was placed in, with what with all the psyops going on. And it's worth contemplating.
Well, I'll tell you something that's interesting about that, which is I've learned something about esoteric schools, and that they work to block something called a specter. And a specter is something which comes over a group and is aimed at them. It's almost like a psychic attack, but it's more to change their mind about something. So it's to influence them, and that they actually work actively against these specters. Now, what's odd is when I was looking into HARP, through the work of Ilana Freeland, it's very interesting because one of the things about HARP, even though it's a weather modification device, is it was developed and designed to go over a certain area and influence the attitudes and emotions of the people involved. It's actually in the patent for HARP. And I was thinking how like a specter this is. So when we understand certain occult principles and certain less esoteric principles, we get a bigger idea on the technology of the world. I think what I want to summarize about John King, and we'll move on to your questions, is this. King is important because if King is Henry Morgan, then he was the kind of buccaneer who dominated the Hotzone for the crown. If he was a medium, if he had those psychic abilities, then they may have been after more than just dominating. They may have been after, beyond gold and all that, they may have been after this whole Cuban story itself. And they may have been after things that they heard about in the Hotzone, including some of the strange stories, like what we had through the Tua de Danann, through that area, which is this whole thing about Fountain of Youth, regenerative temples, whatever it would happen to be. Remember Ponce de Leon, on his way to Florida, this is what he's looking for. He's heard about this, and the rumor comes out of Bimini. And what do we have Ernest Hemingway's brother doing, investing all this time in this healing well in Bimini, and talking about how people can cure their arthritis and all the rest of it. So I think we need to look at Morgan through this figure of John King coming into these mediumistic circles and thinking of his history attached to the Hotzone the way that it is. It gives us a special insight on Blavatsky and the Hotzone. This is another one of those spirit manifestation photos of Katie King during one of these very unusual seances going on in this period. Now, although we have so many fakes later dealing with this material, the genuine work of people like Emma Britton and all the rest, we know that they were legitimate, and we know that Blavatsky had these abilities. So we have to kind of take a look at that and say, what was the thing that was happening here, and what is this withdrawal that Steiner talks about? The mystery schools just decide we're going to pull that back and try something else. Okay.
Okay, so Aether wants to know, did John and Katie King have any relationship with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle? I wonder if Doyle and Blavatsky had similar visions or dreams of Atlantis in their writings.
Well, there's no doubt that Blavatsky wrote extensively about Atlantis. It's the Book of Zion, which is Dzyan, or Book of Zan as it's called sometimes, is predominantly about Atlantis by Blavatsky, and I have just a little bit of it that I'll read for you. It is all about, I'm going to introduce a new character here, King Thevatat in Atlantis. This is from the Book of Zan, which is an incredibly interesting book that is included in the Secret Doctrine. And it's short, but it has these stanzas in it, and it lays out this history of Atlantis. And one of the things that Steiner had to say about it was that this was literally a book that was in a Tibetan monastery that, in essence, Blavatsky had smuggled out. Quite remarkable. So let's get to a good quote here. Okay, so here's what she has to say. We have to add that the class of hierophants was divided into two distinct categories: those who were instructed by the sons of God of the island of Atlantis, and those who were initiated in the divine doctrine of pure revelation, and others who inhabited the Lost Atlantis, if such must be its name, and who, being of another race, were born with a sight which embraced all hidden things. So the Atlanteans, the way that she describes them, have natural psychic ability. They're born with it. They don't even have to work to develop it. They were independent of both distance and material obstacle. In short, they were the fourth race of men mentioned in the Popol Vuh. This is interesting because now she's citing the Mayan Holy Book. Their sight was unlimited, and they knew all things at once. That's pretty good. They were perhaps what we would now term natural-born mediums, who neither struggled nor suffered to attain their knowledge, nor did they acquire it at the price of any sacrifice. Therefore, while the former walked in the path of their divine instructors, acquiring their knowledge by degrees, learned at the same time to discern the evil from the good, the born adepts of Atlantis blindly followed the insinuations of the great invisible dragon, the King Thevatat. Someone suggests that this is the serpent in Genesis story. Quick thing here about Thevatat. Thevatat, that's Thevetat, has neither learned nor acquired knowledge, but to borrow an expression from Dr. Wilder in relation to the tempting of the serpent, he was a sort of Socrates who knew without being initiated. He was born with this ability. Thus, under the evil insinuations of their demons, Thevatat, the Atlantis race, became a nation of wicked magicians. A nation of wicked magicians. That's tough. And this has the echoes of the Belial group again when we're looking at this.
What were you just reading from?
That is the Book of Zan, and it's the King Thevatat section of the Book of Zan in The Secret Doctrine by Blavatsky.
Wow, that took my breath away at the end.
Isn't it amazing? Yeah, that's really, when we remember, there's a reason for the extegonography coming out of that. Because when you think of a nation of wizards who are evil, and the small group of Amelia's, people trying to work with this crystal to be spiritually enlightened, and you've got this whole other thing happening. I think what we're seeing is Blavatsky's story about Thevatat lines up with Casey's story of Belial and Steiner's story of Ahriman. This is the darker astral force that comes in and controls Atlantis and leads to its destruction. Somehow, this story and the history of it, and Blavatsky's presence there in the Hotzone, and Theosophy's huge presence in the Hotzone, with over 300 lodges on Cuba, there's something about our ancient history which has always been concealed, and the advent of the mystery schools from Theosophy through Anthroposophy and the Casey work give us, and the Gurdjieff work also, gives us that information directly through a public medium. These are public mystery schools now, drawing on esoteric knowledge. This is apparently what they've decided, the mystery schools, is required. And especially in the case of Blavatsky and Steiner's work, is so applicable to and predicts so well what we're facing in the 21st century with the massive wave of transhumanism. So I think that when we look at these figures like Blavatsky, like Steiner, and the things that they're bringing forward, we have to keep in mind that they are setting us up with a buffer against this incredible wave of technological control, at which point, with the scientific materialism, humanity's progress itself is in danger. So this is why getting a greater understanding of the episodes that take place in the development of that mystery school teaching is so crucial. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Justin Thomas said, this other race Blavatsky speaks of, ... an alien race?
I wouldn't be surprised. Where
do aliens fit into Theosophy?
Well, it's interesting. Both Theosophy and Anthroposophy seem to reference them.
Ew.
But it does seem...
How is that?
Well, it's interesting because when they talk about star beings and things of this nature, and, certainly in Theosophy you have Ledbetter talking about people from other worlds, and Olcott as well. But the revelation about the alien part, of course, that got saved until 47 in the waves, and that's when everyone started talking about it. So we can look at, what happened very interestingly is a lot of the people who were like Space Brothers and all that kind of thing put together a theosophical, they were theosophists before that, and then suddenly they became interested in this Space Brother thing. So I think that's where it goes next. But in their period, the object seemed to be to inform us about Atlantis. And this had to, one of the key parts of our understanding is remembering this cycle and getting the real story. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Well, let's go back a little bit. So, Fuber Fighter
Yes.
was asking, and other people were asking also, so what was the original religion of Blavatsky? Was
Well,
she Russian Orthodox?
Yeah,
You know?
she grew up in a traditional household in Russia, and as a matter of fact, that's why she was, in essence, had that arranged marriage. So, what's interesting is that Steiner, when looking at her previous lives, had pointed out that she'd had some encounters, basically, with Christian religion. And, you know, we know that Annie Besant had been burned at the stake as Giordano Bruno, for example. So Blavatsky had a distortion about Christianity, and that's what prevented her from really moving into the Western mystery tradition. And the way that anthroposophy interprets it, which we'll use here, is they're saying there's an Eastern mystery tradition, and it set up the Western one, and this is the era where the Western one needed to come forward. That is, the esoteric Christianity needed to be the next wave to inform the culture. And instead, what's happened is Theosophy got kind of boomeranged back into celebrating the East, which is crucial, but it got boomeranged into celebrating just the Eastern part again, and it lost this connection with the esoteric Christian Western tradition, which is to infuse Christianity with the knowledge of the East, like reincarnation. And this is, you know, the school of the prophets, the Essenes. That's the whole mystical side of Christianity, the Jewish Kabbalah. That's all part of a whole tradition. And originally, Christianity included reincarnation. It got pulled in the 3rd century AD. So, in Steiner's view, that's what's supposed to happen. Instead, Theosophy, through some of these actions of these schools being afraid of Blavatsky, she became the tool of these Eastern schools who just wanted to go back to the idea that the East will save the world. But that's not the next step. They set up the next step, which was the Western initiators, which is why the Rosicrucian stream, the anthroposophical stream, is informing the next step of spiritual revelation. It's quite fascinating when you get on those minutiae levels. Of course, the best of all these traditions support each other, whether, you know, the Buddhist tradition and the Christian tradition, they fundamentally agree. Yes.
So, Jeremy Dark Eagle wants to know, are we about due for a new Blavatsky?
No question about it. But I think also, the thing is, absorbing the teaching that the mystery schools have left us, it's a process of assimilation. So Gurdjieff described it like this, that the mystery schools push the lesson out, and they don't build, you know, it's not that they're supposed to build large organizations into perpetuity, that they'll create this organization, they'll be there, and then they'll move on, they'll spread all these seeds, and then they'll come back. So there's no question that Steiner said that in 1916, he said that there would be a window that would open where anthroposophy and the mystery schools would take another chance, and we would have another chance of working with those mystery schools. Because what was happening was, during World War I, he was saying that the mystery schools had failed to stop that. And as a result, we wouldn't have the opportunity, again, to work at this level for 100 years. So that brought us into this period. Because so there's basically about a 3-decade window from 2016. So 2016 to 2046, loosely, is this window of the mystery schools operating, becoming an operation again. In the meantime, we've been absorbing all of the information that they've pushed through the culture, like Theosophy, Anthroposophy, the Gurdjieff work, and the Casey work. That's a lot of material to work with. Have we actually worked with it? Have we assimilated it? Can we move on to the next level? That's really the question. My thought is that we need that information to face the transhumanism future that we're looking at in the 21st century. Yes.
Okay, so Esoteric 369 Wall. Claiming Morgan as a guide, did Blavatsky have him on the same level as Ascended Masters? I had that same question. It didn't make sense to me that someone so recently incarnated as a buccaneer, as a privateer, would be really part of the Great White Brotherhood.
It is interesting. Well, I think we have to look at a couple of. There's two answers to that. One, was John King just a masquerade by one of her masters? That was one.
And why would they do that?
Well, they talked a little bit about that.
A trickster?
That there are different tools for learning.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I mean, a trickster is certainly it. But what's funny is that Olcott felt that John King was created for him, too, that he learned so much through Blavatsky training him this way. There are different lessons there. I think this is what Blavatsky had to say about John King. Ready? Direct from her lips. The spirit of John King is very fond of me, and I am fonder of him than of anything on earth. He is my only friend, and if I am indebted to anyone for the radical change in my ideas of my life, my efforts, and so on, it is to him alone. He has transformed me, and I shall be indebted to him when I go to the upper story for not having to dwell for centuries in darkness and gloom. It sounds like an ascended master using a disguise. I mean, that's a lot of holy reverence that she has. Now, Olcott initially thought John King was evil because of his juvenile tricks. John's antics did not conform to Olcott's idea of acceptable behavior for an angel. Blavatsky persuaded him otherwise. She knew that spirits must not be judged according to humans or worldly notion of things. Blavatsky could command elementals, but claimed she was incapable of controlling John King. Her second sight usually worked with both humans and lower sprites, but John's actions could not be predicted. Masters generally employed intermediaries to transmit commands and teachings. In the Eastern tradition, these couriers often displayed a reverence for earthly Moors, partly because they operated from the astral realm. John King's fundamental decency and role as guardian angel convinced Blavatsky he was a white entity, despite his picaresque.
Picaresque?
Picaresque.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, John, that's a great question.
wait,
wait.
I want it. This is the final quote from her. This is no mediumship, and by no means an impure power. It has too strong an ascendancy over us all, leaving us into better ways. No devil would act like that. What she said, first of all, is that no spirit could dominate her. It had never happened, because even in her trance work, she had stayed fully conscious. So she feels through this that this John King thing is basically Kutumi taking on the mask of this Henry Morgan character. Why? I'm not sure it was done, but it is quite interesting, I think, when you think of Katie King, who comes up and then is the next kind of celebrity in these spiritualistic circles, and she's giving all this information, and she's his daughter, and she's the one who supposedly opened his eyes in the spiritual realm. So it is quite an interesting saga. I think that we have to say that the John King aspect of Blavatsky's life has to be understood, because I could have gone through all of her Ascended Master teachings, and it's funny because when Olcott talks about those different masters, he says some of them are living and some of them are on the ethereal plane. So she credited John King with transmitting messages from the Luxor Lodge's Committee of Seven. That's one of the main mystery schools there in Egypt, which included living adepts such as Serapis Bey, who was the Grand Master, Master Hilarion, Tuatit Bey, and Metamon. So these are all part of that thing. And Olcott later described Master Serapis Bey as a handsome Cypriot, Greek with fair complexion, blue eyes, and copper-colored hair. And it's pretty interesting because there are other Theosophists now who thought that it was one of these masters that did this whole thing through this figure of John King as like a teaching mechanism to keep Blavatsky grounded. It is quite a fascinating mystery. One quick last thing about John King, which is Marina Caesar Sisson, who is a theosophist, has written a monograph suggesting that Paulos Metamon, who lived in Cairo, created the John King phenomena through astral travel. Henry Olcott stated that King's frivolities of speech and action were meant to cover serious business. So it is a trickster lesson. Blavatsky admitted to Alexander Askakov that John King, had spiritually regenerated her. So it is quite fascinating, the mystery of John King and Blavatsky, and we can see embedded in King the X-steganography, and there it is. I think that we have a great insight there on the mystery schools from King, and that is a piece I think that we can definitely dig into more. But there is something I want to say about King, which is, as far as Blavatsky was concerned, this was the master who was leading her into these lodges. And so it is quite interesting that he would use this mask. Yes.
So Najat was asking, could John King be Ahriman? Touche. I don't think so, but interesting.
No, I don't think so. I'll tell you, it goes back to a weird story that that Steiner tells about Annie Besant, which is that these the groups of masters that were coming to her were these projections from a combination of these Eastern adepts and these German philosophers who wanted theosophy to go in a particular direction, and that's where the whole Krishnamurti thing came from. But he said that true initiators stood at the cradle of theosophy, and that Blavatsky was a real world teacher, and that she did open up all these doors that were meant to stop us from sliding into that door that was open to scientific materialism in 1840, because the mystery schools, the way he described it, they looked down the road and they said, look, we won't recognize humanity in 100 years. This is going to be, they won't recognize themselves. They'll be completely disconnected from their spirituality. And when we look around now and you see people buried in their phones, you have to say that those groups in the mystery schools understood that, you know, at least by letting these things out, even if the culture wasn't ready for it, they were giving us some tools to battle against this wave, which I think is crucial. That's why I think figures like Blavatsky have to be understood in a different way, and like Casey, which is for the amount of work that they did to bring this public and really to have themselves there as, you know, figures of scorn, figures of ridicule, whatever it happened to be, that they risked it to bring us that mystery school knowledge, and that the fruits of that knowledge are what we have now from theosophy in the work of Rudolf Steiner through anthroposophy. And particularly in the case of anthroposophy, we have the tools to kind of face the 21st century. Miss Olivia, we'll take a couple more questions, then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, so the chat was cooking so much I couldn't follow everything you were saying tonight. So Justin Thomas said, I wonder if Crowley and Blavatsky crossed paths. Their lifetimes were not
No.
correct for that, right?
No,
and,
they didn't.
Tessa
Crowley crossed paths with Gurdjieff.
Mm-hmm.
And Gurdjieff,
as we know,
Gurdjieff threw him out of his
as a degenerate.
his Fontainebleau.
Tessa 1111
yes.
wanted to know if Blavatsky knew Rasputin.
No, Rasputin is 1914, and so this is this kind of era right after. So Blavatsky's more, remember, she comes out in 1875, and as I quoted earlier, she actually wrote 60,000 pages of work between 1875 and 1891, but before that she'd never written anything, so this is quite remarkable to think about with her. She was created for this mission to bring these truths out and bring it together. And, you know, part of the thing we try to do tonight is kind of look at some of the sources. And we could have gone the traditional route of looking at her Ascended Master sources. But something about the John King thing, I feel like that's where we get some real insight into what was happening with her personally. Because remember, all these people are human. And from Gurdjieff to Casey, even though they have these incredible abilities, you know, they need to be kind of helped along by the mystery schools. And so when I saw the John King thing, it looked to me like there was a presence there of John King. It was like the mystery schools coming down from this level. It wasn't like the Master Kuthumi walking alongside her. And, you know, it was someone almost on her own level as John King. It was like, as a former pirate, things like that. So, but his presence throughout spiritualism in the 1870s is, you know, is quite a phenomena to examine. Yes.
Well, okay, I'm going to ask this one first. Okay, so Esoteric 369 Wall, Blavatsky claiming 100 years of purgatory. What karma did she feel that she had to have deserved that?
No, she didn't claim 100 years of purgatory. No, actually, that was Morgan, when he comes back as a spirit, says for all the things that he did, you know, he misused his psychic ability when the crown used him to take over Cuba and places like that. And so when he came back, he had to go through, in spiritual, you know, on the spiritual plane, he's giving these messages that he had to go through a kind of purgatory. Blavatsky didn't go through a purgatory. What I was saying about her was that Steiner is talking about a period where the schools became very afraid of her and what she might release, especially schools that are associated with political movements, so the more left-hand kind of schools. And they put her in a cult imprisonment. That lasted for 3 years. And it was basically, when I go to check in psychically, when I use my mediumistic or my clairvoyant abilities, I get blocked, or I get misdirected, or I get the wrong information. That's the process that they did. But certainly no, she was not in any purgatory, and she was a very self-sacrificing individual. Yes.
Okay, so Justin Thomas, so these Morgans were pirates,
Yes.
Templars, agents of Rockefeller, Rothschilds, usurping secrets like Tesla discoveries and covering them up. What is the Rothschild connection to this? What is the Templar? We get a lot of questions about the Templar connection to the pirates.
Yeah, it's true. Well, it's interesting. Here's a couple of things that we know about the Templars. I recommend Professor Farrell, Dr. Farrell's book. And, you know, we did an incredible episode on it, which is Thrice Great Hermetica. The episode's called Akhenaten Prophecy. The book is called Thrice Great Hermetica. And in it, Dr. Farrell covers so much about the Templars and the Crusades and that whole period, and how Columbus was really somebody who was just used as the agent of the discovery of America, that we had already discovered it, and that these groups, the Templars, had discovered it as far back as the 11th century. So when we go back and we look, and a lot of the people who looked for that hooked X, even here in Massachusetts, there's the entire outline of one of these Templar Knights, and that's 12th century. Casey had indicated Templars, and also Eric the Red had been in America as far as Minnesota. So certainly there were things going on back and forth. A lot of it may have concerned a gold trade. Once they realized there was gold here, this is what they became so obsessed with. And that may have been going on for 200 years before the traditional discovery of America by Christopher Columbus.
Okay, Bruce Wayne. I've heard twice that there's a tunnel from Gitmo to the Lost City. Any chance of truth to that? With all the secrets around Atlantis and all the major players going to Cuba, the Gitmo tunnel sort of makes sense.
I agree.
What do you think?
No, well, it's very interesting. You hear a lot about tunnels, actually. I will say this. The ruins are off Cuba, off the western tip of Cuba. Polina Zalitsky found, in essence, an underwater city. It's kind of game over there. They blocked that story, and unfortunately, the archaeological community did not support Zalitsky. And I think that we need to make efforts to bring Polina Zalitsky's work off the western tip of Cuba and her discoveries back into the public eye and get this censorship off. I do feel that people in even alternative archaeology, you know, because Zalitsky is kind of autonomous. You know, she works with ADC, which is her own company in Canada. She has her own story. And she wasn't in the milieu of these people writing books about Atlantis or ancient discoveries. So I think she was kind of not supported, and in fact, for her discoveries, was harassed and even put in a Mexican jail for a period of time. So she got back to Canada, and I think she's just like, forget it. And I don't blame her. But the fact is, for people who are concerned with our history and the things that have been covered up in relation to it, her discovery, is absolutely crucial. And that's where all the focus that we have in relation to looking for Atlantis should be, because she found it. I mean, it's there, and even National Geographic had to admit those were ruins down there. They didn't say what they were, but I mean, we've already got what she found. I mean, we already have it. So why reinvent the wheel? We've got Casey's discovery off Bimini Island. We have the western tip of Cuba. They're both related to the Atlantean ruins. That's where the emphasis should be. And there are incredible blocks around Cuba because of the political situation. But like I said, we still got Bimini. And I want to remind everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. We've gone really deep with Blavatsky and the Hotzone. Some Theosophy, some Steiner, some John King. And it is really...
It's been a poo-poo platter.
it's an amazing smorgasbord of esoteric facts and figures. I want to remind you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, get on board. Remember, with the social media, the way that we're seeing it, it's absurd, right? People are getting thrown off left and right. And the only way we can guarantee that kind of communication is through the newsletter. So sign up for the newsletter. It's free. And you get a newsletter about once a week letting you know what shows are coming up and what incredible events we have coming up for you. Also, while you're there, subscribe to Dark Journalists. We've made it very affordable. Get on board. You're going to want to be a subscriber this fall. We have incredible interviews and spotlights coming up that will be worth it and totally blow your mind. Okay,
Johann Wolf.
Yes.
We've had similar questions before. This always comes up. Curious what you both think are the major mystery groups behind Trump, and what do you feel that plan is?
Well, I've pointed out there's an episode that we did for the X series called Tesla, Trump, and the Time Capsule, where I outline what that is, and it relates to his uncle John Trump being the protege of Vannevar Bush at MIT for the Rad Lab. That's where they controlled the UFO file, and it was Robert Sarbarker, the physicist, who's been basically written out of history, who told us that Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO file, and that they did, in fact, re-engineer a UFO material. So that's where we would go with that one. That would be my suggestion. Yes.
Okay, I just wanted to say, all night we've had people coming in saying they didn't get notification there would be a show, etc.
The best way to do it is the newsletter.
9 times out of 10, there's a show on Friday night. So
that's
just
true.
come.
Friday night at 8 o'clock, yeah.
Write it down and show up.
Absolutely. It's a great point. But also keep in mind that if you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter, you'll get that in your inbox. That's the best way to stay up to date, ultimately. You can subscribe to the channel and hit the bell and all that for YouTube, but I'm not sure what they're up to. That is for sure. Okay, Miss Olivia, the last question of the night. The pressure is on. The stakes are high.
Well, I saved this one for last. So Michael Putman wanted to know, what are the names of some good books about Helena Blavatsky, her life? I'm also interested in mystery school books. Any recommendations? Thank you.
The best book is Old Diary Leaves, which is a series of books by Henry Olcott, which are very full of hope, or a little heartbreaking at times, and fascinating throughout. So I'd recommend those. There are a series of bios and things of Blavatsky. So I think that, I don't know that I could say any one was better than the other, but I think that some of the work by Jocelyn Wilson is quite impressive, and I also, in general, I actually like the Steiner book about occult movements in the 19th century and Blavatsky. That book by Steiner, which is a series of lectures about it, is absolutely fascinating.
Okay.
Yeah, and in general, I mean, Steiner's work, knowledge of higher worlds, and its attainment is kind of fundamental. In Search of the Miraculous, which is P.D. Ouspensky's account of his years with Gurdjieff, absolutely stunning. And Edgar Cayce on Atlantis would be absolutely required reading. No
yeah,
question
and I
about
want to
it.
say, even though Ledbetter is a very controversial figure,
Oh, fantastic
he really
work.
brings these
Yes.
concepts down to earth
Yes.
and makes them very comprehensible. I'm extremely intimidated by the Blavatsky books, but which is why I've never read them. But we have the Ledbetter books, and they're
Yes.
they're
C.W. Ledbetter, The Hidden Side of Things, it's a theosophical classic, and then one written with Annie Besant, Thought Forms, which is a thin little book talking about the impact of our thoughts. Absolutely crucial information. This one, which has been my favorite for many years, at least before college, Cosmic Memory, and that is, it's actually Atlantis and Lemuria by Rudolf Steiner, an incredible overview of the Atlantean period. And in terms of Blavatsky, of course, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine, Part 1 and 2, they're incredible. I do feel that her work is incredibly valuable, and that her contribution has really moved the culture dramatically and given us so much of the kind of a window into the mystery schools that we didn't have. And I feel that somehow she made it through all the difficulties and the incredible challenges. And she only lived till 60, and she accomplished so much. So she's a remarkable woman for us to look back on, and really someone who moved the spiritual work out into the broader public. And so she's a real heroine in that sense, in my opinion.
And I would say, for someone just starting on this, Edgar Cayce is just starting with one of his, but because although it works, everything is solid in there, as far as I'm concerned. It all connects with Steiner and Blavatsky. So, what is your favorite Cayce bio?
Well, See You're Out of Season by Harmon Brough is a great book. And the newer book by Sidney Kirkpatrick is quite excellent, actually.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
I think it's Edgar Cayce and American Prophet. Those are both excellent books. And the original one is There Is a River by Thomas Chagru, which is the first one that brought Cayce to the public. And then in 1968, the Jess Stern book, The Sleeping Prophet, that's the bestseller that got, Cayce was largely, during his own life, was underappreciated, let's put it to you that way. So therefore, I think all those books contain an incredible legacy of the work that Cayce did. And I think when we think about Atlantis in particular, and the things we're talking about involving the Hotzone, there is no better work than the Cayce work on Atlantis. It outclasses even the best. So I highly recommend all the Atlantis readings. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think we are done for the evening.
Okay.
I thank you, everyone, for joining us. What an amazing show on this special 144th anniversary of the Theosophical Society. I thank you all so much for joining us.
By the way, did you get into those Florida?
No.
There's
I
a
have
secret?
some very special information. We have a very special visitor in town also.
Mm-hmm.
So I will tell you all about that next week on Friday. Join us here at 8 o'clock. Be looking forward to it. X Series episode 67 will be here. And it's great to see you out there. Esoteric 369, Mermaid Moxie, Scarlet Fire. Thank you so much for joining us. I just see some familiar names. Grandma Tippy Toes, now you're talking. It's great to see you. Density McCartney, Scruples, of course. Fantastic to see everyone. We will join you again next week.
I have to thank some super chatters.
Yes.
First of all, Chuck Berge,
Yes.
Dark Tuner 888, GDNPB, Alpha Warrior, Christian Anthony, Scabtree Scabby, Dale Triplet, and Jacqueline. Thank you so very much.
Wow, excellent. And did you also, you have one other one. Yes.
Oh, well, I don't know this.
I
what's
will.
the name?
You know what? Next week.
We got our
yes.
first lifetime membership.
Yes.
And I didn't write down the person's name, so I can't, but thank you.
We will.
We will
yes.
honor
We'll
you next week.
Next week we'll mention that. But fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for supporting the show. It's unbelievably.
I did also want to say one thing.
Yes.
So it is Flo In Through's birthday. So happy birthday. And Flo In Through, don't know whether it's male or female, said, after reading Steiner, my meditation has been enhanced. Thank you, DJ, for that.
Oh,
A
wow.
lot of people have been turned on to Steiner because of you,
Uh-huh.
and they've said that same thing, that their meditations are so much more profound now. And they're listening to the lectures on YouTube by that wonderful narrator.
Oh yes,
With a
yes. There's an
fantastic
awful lot of material that's available for Steiner, and I recommend always buying the books and things like that. But you can certainly get a taste of all the work of anthroposophy and what he was about. Steiner's work is incredibly enriching from a number of levels. I just feel like he's 5 people born into one, and it's great when we realize the amount of things that are just available right there for us. That's the wonderful thing about it, which is it's all right there. The Casey work, the mystery schools have left an incredible legacy through Blavatsky and through Theosophy as well. So, take advantage of it. It's there for you. And if you find yourself, if there's too many negative stories about Epstein or whatever, or the militarization of space, these things are all important, but sometimes it is the spiritual information, I think, that will inform us the best. And we will see you all next week. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend. And Miss Olivia, the last the last thought is,
You have to say hi to Rika.
hey, Rika.
Rika is demanding it.
Rika, the hopeful voluntarist. I've seen you out there a few times, and of course, you've been a regular and always fascinating.
Knitting
with questions.
away.
Knitting away.
Mm-hmm.
It's always great to see you out there, Rika. We will be back next week, and I saw Tessa's out there. I know Kate was out there earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Great to see you. And did we have dimensions or not?
Yes, Carly was
Carly,
in
fantastic.
early. People are learning to love Carly.
Of course.
I'm getting
She's
threatened.
fantastic. Yeah, now you're talking. Here comes Carly. Great to see everyone out there. And finally, Miss Olivia.
Well, I don't know.
What are you in the mood for now?
People were talking about the spiced rum and all the different drinks they could have with the spiced rum. And Renner Newton said spiced rum and ginger beer with a maraschino cherry. And I have to say, that sounds really good.
Swinging for the fences,
So
as they
I'm
say.
very food suggestible, so all I need to do is read something, and I want it. So, and then earlier somebody was talking about Malamars, so that's I don't have either right now, but that's what I want.
Hey, listen, I heard you talking about sriracha earlier, so
That I have.
we'll see y'all next week, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a great weekend, and happy anniversary to the Theosophical Society.
Mm-hmm. And happy full moon, Friday 13th.
Excellent point.
Mm-hmm.
Sriracha.
Harvest moon.
Harvest moon. Thank you, everyone. Oh, well, it says stop the broadcast, but it never, ever stops.